Vivien's first love screwed up and caused a medical accident. That night, Vivien cut off Stephen's dad's meds to force him to take the fall for it. She sat across from him with a signed confession. Once he signed the agreement, Stephen would never be able to hold a scalpel in the country again. On the bed, his dad was breathing rapidly with his eyes closed. Vivien toyed with the oxygen tube. "Stephen, you've got 2 minutes. If you don't sign in 2, your dad suffocates. That'll be on you." Stephen was shaking, his lips turning white. "Vivien, if I don't sign, will you kill my dad?" "He's the most important person to me," he said. Vivien laughed. "Stephen, Richard is the most important person to me. I gave you marriage, so I owe him in other ways." She leaned forward a bit, looking intensely at Samuel on the bed, who was making rasping sounds from lack of oxygen. Vivien watched with interest, counting aloud, 40, 41, 42, 43. With each number she counted, Stephen got paler. He couldn't figure out how things got so messed up. They were worlds apart. He was just an ordinary surgeon, and she was a rich heiress. To marry him, she spent a day and night kneeling in the rain. On the day they got their marriage certificate, she clung to him, crying like crazy, "Stephen, our wedding will be the grandest in town." Inside 2 years, Stephen's wedding had been called off twice. The first time, her childhood friend threatened to kill himself, and she left Stephen at the altar. As she left, she said, "Stephen, I love you. I'll be back after I calm him down. Wait for me." He stood alone at the ceremony from noon to evening, and Vivien never showed. He became the laughingstock of South City. The second attempt, she walked away just as they picked up the rings. Richard's tearful call made her drop everything and leave. Later, Stephen saw her carefully helping Richard at the hospital, whose finger was wrapped in a bandage. Stephen realized she left him for a mere scrape on Richard's finger. She used to beg him to marry her, promising to take care of him forever. But now, she was the one hurting him most. Stephen teared up, slowly picked up the pen, and signed his name. "Vivien, I hate you," he said, tossing the paper aside and rushing to plug the oxygen tube back in. Unbothered, Vivien gracefully picked up the paper. "Love comes with hate, Stephen. I know you love me. Don't worry, Vivien's husband will always be you. In a week, it's our wedding. This time, I promise you a grand ceremony." Vivien left. Stephen sneered at the wedding idea. He pulled out his phone and called his dad's doctor friend. "Alex, you mentioned that my dad's condition could be treated overseas. Can we arrange for him to be transferred now?" "Sure, if you really want to. He can fly over on my private jet in 3 days when I head back to the US. You handle things here first, then come over." Stephen agreed. "I'll be there around 4 days later. See you then." He took a long look at his dad's face. "Dad, let's never come back here. We can avoid anyone hurting you," he whispered, then left. Stephen drafted up divorce papers and took them to Richard. They worked at the same hospital, but Richard was already a chief doctor, while Stephen was just an associate. "Stephen, thanks a bunch. You won't be a doctor anymore, huh?" Richard sneered when he saw him. Ignoring that, Stephen tossed the agreement on the table. "Get Vivien to sign this. I'm done with both of you." Richard immediately noticed the divorce papers. "And why would I help you?" he asked. "If not, you'll always be a homewrecker," Stephen replied. Richard paused, then said, "Did you know your marriage certificate with Vivien was fake?" Stephen staggered, eyes wide. "What?" Richard looked down at him. "You thought you could marry into the Millers? That whole thing was a trick. The Millers can easily get a fake marriage certificate done at the registry. Don't believe me? Go check it out yourself." He chipped at Stephen's pallor. "Vivien knows, by the way." What Richard left out was that Vivien only found out the certificate was fake last month, but it didn't matter to the current situation. Stephen remembered their joy when they got married. Vivien even drove him to the mountain to watch stars. They kissed under the romantic sky, promising each other a lifetime. Now he realized it was all fake. Laughing with tears running down, unsteady as if he could collapse any moment, Stephen made his way back to the villa. This was his and Vivien's home where they lived after their wedding. He liked grapes, so Vivien planted him a grapevine and installed a swing. They would swing on it in the summer. Now he took a shovel to the grapevine, knocking down the arbor, just like his love. He pulled down their giant wedding photo from the living room and burned it, along with 99 love letters from Vivien. Vivien returned just as the burning ended. Frowning at the fire, she asked, "What are you doing?" "Mourning," Stephen replied. "Bad luck," she muttered. As she spoke, staff brought in boxes of Rolex watches and Richard showed up. "These gifts were for Richard," Vivien said, since he'd been through a scare and needed comforting. "Stephen, I know you're not into this kind of stuff, so I didn't get you one." She pulled a paper-cut bunny from her pocket, offering it to Stephen. "This is for you. I love you." Stephen looked at the bunny, at the Rolexes, and managed a sarcastic smile. Gifts worth millions for the childhood friend and a paper-cut bunny for him. Oh, what joy! Vivien noticed his reluctance and said sharply, "Stephen." So he took the bunny, tossed it on a table, and muttered, "Thanks." Normally, Stephen treasured anything given by Vivien, whatever it might be. He never would have thrown it away. Vivien bit back her annoyance when Richard handed Stephen a file. "Thanks for today. Here's a gift from me," Richard said. Curious, Vivien tried to see it, but Richard pulled her back. "This is guy stuff, don't look." Fine. Whatever you say," Vivien replied and turned to unpack her gifts with Richard. Their cozy exchange made Stephen's stomach turn. Expressionless, he opened the envelope and found 2 photos. The first showed a man and woman in robes by a hotel window, beaming at the camera. The second showed them naked, kissing in bed. Just that snapshot hinted at the heat and intimacy underneath. Stephen gripped the photos tightly, veins bulging on his forehead. Gagging, he couldn't hold back, running outside to throw up by a wall. He was puking in the courtyard, and through a pane of glass, he could hear laughter from inside. Vivien and Richard were sitting shoulder to shoulder like they were about to kiss. Since he'd decided to leave, Stephen needed to quit his job. But after signing that agreement, he didn't even have to resign. The hospital already sent him a message that he was being fired. Early in the morning, he went to the hospital to pack up his stuff. After working there for a few years, he had very few personal belongings. Only a medical record book seemed important. It contained valuable case studies he planned to use for research later. As soon as Stephen finished packing and left the hospital, someone threw 2 rotten eggs at him. "Incompetent doctor. You killed my dad, you need to pay for this. Heartless doctor, you killed a patient. Pay up." Leaves and water bottles were hurled at him too, and a moment of inattentiveness led to one hitting his forehead, causing him to stagger. Ahead of him, Vivien embraced Richard, who was walking into work. She stood on the outskirts, coldly observing everything. "It wasn't me," Stephen wanted to explain, but an enraged family member had already shoved an article in his face. The hospitals made an official announcement. "It was your mistake that killed my dad." The article was released by the hospital, explaining the medical incident. At the bottom, they'd plastered Stephen's photo, clearly labeling him responsible. Not a single word mentioned Richard. Stephen clenched his fists tightly, catching Vivien's gaze from across the angry crowd. A moment later, Vivien and Richard turned and walked away. As they passed each other, Stephen got slapped, falling to the ground. Through the gaps in the crowd, he saw Vivien walking past without so much as a glance his way. "Vivien, what if Stephen gets hurt?" Richard asked pitifully. 2 seconds later, Stephen heard Vivien's emotionless voice. "He's been like this since childhood. This is nothing. You're different. Those brutes shouldn't lay a finger on you." Vivien pulled Richard closer, ensuring he didn't get touched. As the miller's future son-in-law, he had to be protected. Her voice faded as she walked away. Stephen remained on the ground, attacked and scolded, with tears streaming down his face. "Ha ha ha, serves you right. Vivien, you're something, never a letdown." Despite not being good in the kitchen, there was a time when Vivien had a stomachache, and Stephen made a meal for her. Even a small cut led Vivien to cradle his hand, nearly wanting to call a doctor. He laughed at her then for overreacting, saying he was a doctor. The small cut was nothing. "Stephen, you're my greatest love. Don't even talk about cuts. I'd worry even if you just trimmed your nails," she had said. The person who once proclaimed her love for him now pushed him into the line of fire. He laughed and cried, as if deranged. Perhaps his madness frightened the family members, who eventually left, cursing. Once they were gone, security arrived, but Stephen refused their help and dragged his injured self to visit his father in the ward. He had to pack things up and prepare discharge papers for his father. Once everything was ready, Stephen sent a message to Alex. "Dad, wait for me. Soon. I'll come find you in the US. What's your plan in the US?" Vivien's voice, nightmare-like, came from behind him, making Stephen freeze. He casually stood up. "Nothing, just a friend getting married. I've been invited over for the wedding." Vivien eyed him suspiciously, but Stephen openly handed her his phone. Luckily, his phone showed a pre-made chat record. After reading, Vivien snorted, tossing the phone onto the bed. If Stephen hadn't caught it in time, it would have hit Samuel's stomach. The action tugged at the wound on his arm, making Stephen gasp in pain. Vivien, however, seemed oblivious, yanking him by the wrist out of the room. "Come with me to Richard's office." "I'm not going." "Vivien, let go of me. You wanted me to sign, I did. What more do you want?" "Richard needs a paper. Give him your thesis." Stephen had published many papers on his way to becoming a surgeon. These results were painstakingly accumulated from trials and experiments. And now he had to give them away? He bent down and bit Vivien's arm. "I'm not going." As he turned to leave, Vivien grabbed him by the neck. "Stephen, you still haven't learned obedience. Because of you, Richard can't be my husband. This is your compensation to him." That phrase again. A wave of powerlessness overwhelmed him. "Vivien, let's break up. You can make him your husband." After he said that, Vivien was momentarily stunned, then laughed mockingly. "Break up? We're married, you know that. With my status, divorce is not an option." And then, she firmly gripped Stephen's neck and brought him closer, forcing him to look at her. Vivien smiled. "Stephen, could you bear to leave me? Back then, you even gave up on further studies for my sake. You said it was your honor to become my husband." On the day of getting their marriage license, Stephen thought he was the happiest man alive. Now he felt like the biggest fool. Stephen said nothing, and Vivien, in good spirits, hummed a tune, half dragging, half embracing him to Richard's office. Richard's family is in the medical device business. He graduated, got a medical license abroad, and then was placed in a top hospital as a chief physician. Everything Stephen achieved was through his own hard work. "Stephen, I'm really sorry. But Vivien said what's yours is mine now, so I shouldn't worry. Why don't you send your paper to the computer? Also, there's a case that needs solving." Richard beckoned from his desk. Vivien, sitting with legs crossed and arms rested on her knee, observed like a boss. Meanwhile, Richard stood beside her, leaning closer and whispering occasionally. Stephen sat in Richard's chair, face to face with a computer displaying a photo of Vivien and Richard kissing. The date was from a year ago. Ugh! Stephen felt sick inside, tightly gripping the mouse. Ah! Richard, seeing his action, rushed over. "Stephen, did you just delete my desktop files?" His face fell, and he looked pitifully at Vivien. "Vivien, what am I going to do? The hospital needed those data, and they're gone. Will they yell at me?" "Stephen, I know you're jealous, but you shouldn't joke with data." Richard immediately blamed Stephen. Stephen almost laughed out loud. "Richard, have you even stepped into a lab? Where'd you get data?" Before he could finish, Vivien slapped him, her voice cold and sharp. "Stephen, apologize." Stephen stubbornly looked at her. "Vivien, use your brain. If I deleted files, they'd be in the recycle bin. But you didn't even check before hitting me. You just protect him." Before she could respond, Richard chimed in. "The recycle bin can be cleared too." "Stephen, I know you're jealous, but I promise to keep my distance from Vivien." "No need." Vivien placed her hand on Richard's shoulder and stared gravely at Stephen. Her thin lips parted. "He needs to learn a lesson." She tapped Richard on the shoulder, then marched over, roughly pulling Stephen by the wrist and dragging him out. Stephen was locked in the lab. Vivien said, "Since he deleted Richard's data, He must recreate it in the lab. 8 p.m. tomorrow, Stephen, don't disappoint me. With that, Vivien shut the lab door, leaving with Richard. Stephen spent all day in the lab and was no stranger to the equipment there. He had no idea which experiment Richard was talking about or what data he needed. Richard was clearly just looking for an excuse to pick a fight. But Vivien believed Richard. Stephen chuckled to himself. He was feeling like a failure. He was leaving in a few days and didn't want to start any trouble at the last moment. Reluctantly, he decided to slap together some kind of experiment to fake it. Just as he was about to pick up a glass tube, Stephen's sharp eyes caught something below it. His pupils widened in shock, and he couldn't pull back in time. A scream and an explosion happened simultaneously. The lab door blew open from the blast. Though Stephen ducked out of the way, pieces of glass still cut his face, arms, and legs. He fell into the gap between some cabinets, and smoke from the explosion quickly filled the room. Coughing uncontrollably, his legs struck with pain, he had to crawl his way out, hacking with each movement. Each step drained all strength from him. Stephen barely made it to the doorway, reaching out instinctively for help from passing people. Help, help, he mumbled, lifting his head. From his low angle, he could see Vivien's icy face peering down at him. Tenderly nestled against Richard, Vivien cast a cold glance over at the bleeding Stephen on the ground. Vivien, Richard murmured softly, and Vivien quickly patted his back. It's okay, she replied gently, and then she kicked Stephen with rage-filled eyes. Look what you've done. I'm really disappointed in you, Stephen. With that, she left with Richard firmly in her embrace, heading off towards the emergency room. Stephen, already weak, passed out the moment she kicked him. In the haze, he watched Vivien's figure slowly disappear. He woke up in the hospital room, bandages on his face, and Vivien sitting with her arms crossed. As he stirred, Vivien coldly glanced his way. You're awake? Let's go. Time to apologize. Stephen's mind filled with question marks. But Vivien wasn't planning to explain. She tore out his foreline, ignoring the bleeding pinhole, and rudely hauled him up from the bed. Ouch! Vivien, what the hell is wrong with you? I'm injured. Vivien didn't even let him put on shoes, dragging him out of the room. Injured? Stephen, you caused a medical incident to harm Richard. If you're hurt, that's what you deserve. Stephen stumbled along, his bare feet aching with pain, but none of that hurt as much as Vivien's accusations. Did she really think he caused the explosion out of jealousy? He laughed hollowly, looking at Vivien with a strange expression. Vivien, I'm sorry for ever loving you. You seriously are a jerk. Maybe it was his unnerving combination of laughter and tears, but Vivien let go of him near the elevator. He slammed into the wall with all his weight, crying out in pain. Unfazed, Vivien coldly declared, Stephen, I know it's jealousy. I'll let you off this time. Just wait for the wedding. Then she walked away, not bringing up the apology again. 3 days to the wedding and Stephen got dragged to the Miller's party. Before that, he saw the supposedly injured Richard, wearing the exact same suit as Stephen, but clearly more tailored. Richard had a band-aid on his forehead. When he spotted Stephen, he smiled sheepishly. Stephen, did Vivien give you a hard time? She was overreacting. I told her it was nothing and not to bother you, but she insisted it was all your fault, that you made me get hurt. With a smirk, Richard added, no hard feelings, right? Though Stephen caught the provocative glance, he shook his head. No, it's fine. Richard gave a knowing nod. Good. Richard led the way into the venue, arm in arm with Vivien, while Stephen trailed behind like a lackey. Funny thing is, for all the time they'd known each other, Stephen never attended any of Vivien's social events, mostly because he was too busy, and Vivien claimed it'd be inconvenient. She surrounded herself with elite socialites, and he was just a regular person. Back then, Stephen thought she was sparing him from awkwardness. Now he realized it was probably because she was embarrassed by him. He listened to Richard introducing her around. As a couple, they looked dazzling, navigating effortlessly among the glamorous crowd. But Stephen, wherever he went, felt disdainful glances. Becoming a top surgeon on his own, Stephen had always believed one didn't need endless wealth to be happy. He was content with his life, just glad to be with the person he loved. Feeling those judgmental eyes, he painfully recognized the gap between himself and this elite rich class, reducing him to something like a novelty. Vivien remained oblivious, allowing them to size him up like a commodity without a word. "Vivien, is this your assistant? Quite charming. Vivien, you've got a handsome companion. Why not introduce him to us?" Women gathered, chatting with Vivien, while Stephen stood there watching. Her expression darkened, but she said nothing, just a warning look at him. But he stayed silent, following her words without a peep. "Oh, stop joking. Stephen isn't her assistant. He's a friend of mine," Richard interjected, pulling Stephen along. "Meet our friends, it's good to know them." Stephen obliged with a smile, introducing himself, noting Vivien's expression growing darker with each name. Eventually, her face was beyond unpleasant. "Stephen, wanna dance?" A woman extended her hand, and Stephen took it with a smile. "Sure." He walked away with her, beaming back at Vivien without a hint of discomfort. "Bastard!" Vivien spat bitterly. About to speak, Richard interrupted. "Vivien, let's dance too." Noticing Stephen fitting right in, he smugly remarked, "Looks like Stephen's familiar with these settings. No need to worry in the future." While dancing, Vivien was distracted. As the song ended, she let go of Richard. "Richard, you said he blended into these parties before?" Richard feigned innocence, "Just felt that way, seeing him dance comfortably. It's like he's used to it already. He's not secretly partying all the time, is he?" "Vivien, should you?" Concern in his eyes, Richard left the rest unsaid. In circles like theirs, people used all kinds to elevate their status. Vivien's face soured, and moments later, she stormed over to Stephen dancing, yanking him away amidst the crowd's gasps. After they left, Richard smoothly took over the proceedings as host, maneuvering effortlessly around the room. Stephen was dragged to a medical center, forced into a humiliating full-body examination, particularly emphasizing urological aspects. After checking everything, Vivien's face darkened when she saw the report. "Stephen, you lied to me. You said it was your first time. How do you explain this report, then?" The report Vivien tossed over said, "Patient diagnosed with erectile dysfunction due to prolonged uncontrolled sexual activity." Stephen, who had recently experienced a burn from an explosion and a collision, was now being choked by Vivien. He was barely hanging on. With a wry smile, he said, "Vivien, why are you doubting me? Don't you know how much experience I have?" For the past couple of years, they were together almost every day. Vivien's high demand kept him busy every night. But now these memories were knives stabbing into Stephen. Vivien spoke with disdain. "No wonder you're so obedient. Who knows how many others you've been with." She released him, tossing Stephen to the floor like garbage. Looking down at him like a queen, she said, "I won't divorce you. I'll give you a grand wedding, but Stephen, after we get married, you're quitting your job. You'll stay home and be my son-in-law quietly, without showing your face." With that, Vivien left without a glance back. It was as if marrying Stephen was a favor, one he had no reason to refuse. As soon as she left, two men in black suits came in. They took Stephen back to Vivien's villa against his will, locked him in, and left with the villa's food supplies, under orders not to deliver any more. This was all Vivien's doing. For 2 days, Stephen was trapped in the villa without food, only freed on the wedding day. Starved for 2 days, he looked ghostly pale, but no one cared about his condition. The miller's only daughter's wedding had been a joke twice before. The third was even grander, but the groom had changed. Vivien's mother and Richard came in with a makeup artist. Her mother averted her eyes upon seeing him, saying, "Unlucky. Don't think you'll marry my daughter. Richard is the groom today, not you. You're only a groomsman. Just go through the motions." Vivien's mother looked at him disdainfully. "I agreed to let you go on stage as a groomsman." Vivien wanted that. Stephen felt his nails digging into his palms as he nearly laughed. "How nice, Vivien. You really don't disappoint," doubting him, leading him to do medical tests and a fake wedding. A groomsman, as if she thought of everything. Luckily, Stephen didn't plan to go on stage today. He smiled at Vivien's mom. "Don't worry, Auntie. I'll behave today." With a huff, Vivien's mother left to be with Richard. Richard, dressed in a custom suit with an expensive watch, rode off in the wedding car with his mother. After they left, a servant pointed to a plain black car in the back. "Stephen, this is your car." The lead car was a Rolls-Royce worth tens of millions, while his was a normal car worth less than 10,000. Stephen didn't get in the car. He returned to the villa, changed out of the groomsman's suit into his t-shirt and jeans, grabbed his packed suitcase, and left in a pre-booked car despite anyone's protests. After he left, a servant tried calling Vivien, but couldn't reach her. They then called her mother, who simply hung up after saying she knew. Vivien's mother patted Richard's hand. "Richard, you're my son-in-law now. Auntie's favorite." Stephen's car sped towards the airport. Security, boarding, everything went smoothly. Closing the airplane door aligned with the wedding time. Stephen sent a message to a hacker he'd hired. "Go for it. I want them ruined." The first two Miller weddings were jokes, so the third was at the city's most luxurious hotel. Vivien, the bride, arrived early. The venue was extravagant and dreamy, like stepping into a purple ocean. Stephen loved violets. This was a special preparation for him. Vivien knew the wedding was unfair to him, but Stephen had a lower status. Walking through the ceremony seemed okay. After all, he didn't care about such things. Besides, he wronged Richard first, so this was his way of making amends. Someday, she'd bring him glory. The time came, and Vivien waited with flowers for her escort. The next moment, Vivien was stunned. Richard stepped out, dressed in white, with no sign of Stephen behind him. Richard smiled and reached out to her. "Vivien, I can finally marry you." Vivien didn't immediately take his hand. She stared at him. "Where's Stephen? Wasn't he supposed to be the groomsman? This wedding was for the three of us." Richard shrugged innocently. "I don't know. Been calling him all morning, but no answer. The villa staff said they hadn't seen him. Vivien, maybe he's upset I took his spot. But we can't stay here with everyone watching." Richard's words were met with impatience from the Miller's parents and Richard's family. All eyes on stage. Unlike the first two weddings, this time they invited partners of the Millers. Vivien couldn't act rashly. She hid her doubt, placed her hand in Richard's, and reluctantly went through the ceremony. The vows and ring exchange completed, Vivien rushed backstage to call Stephen. Ring, 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 numerous calls, no answer. Vivien's face turned grim. She gripped the phone tightly, anger flaring. "Stephen, Vivien, we're expected for toasts. They're waiting." Richard approached with a glass. Used to indulging him, for the first time Vivien ignored Richard. "Enough, the ceremony is done. I fulfilled my promise. I have things to do." She briskly left, ignoring Richard's protests. Behind her, Richard was fuming. Vivien drove back to the villa, finding the gates open with only a normal car parked. The driver was complaining to a servant. "Really, I was to pick someone up, but they weren't there. I even got blamed. It's not my fault he ran off." The servant comforted. "It's not your fault." Stephen's odd. Who knew he'd leave in his condition? Vivien stopped, approached the driver, grabbing the back of his neck. "What did you say? Who ran?" Terrified by her glare, the driver couldn't lie. "The one I was to pick up. Not my fault. He ran as I parked. They said not to chase. I'm just doing my job." Vivien looked at the car, momentarily confused. "Who sent you? When did I say to pick someone up?" Despite planning for Stephen as a groomsman, she hadn't meant for him to self-drive. She had arranged a wedding car for him, his favorite Maserati. "Go." Vivien released the driver harshly, watching him fall. Her expression frightened him silent. Only after she left did he regain his breath, patting his chest to calm down. Inside, the villa was empty. Rooms were vacant, save for ribbons from the morning and Richard's discarded clothes. The meticulously chosen groomsman's suit, resembling a wedding outfit, lay on the couch with a torn corner. Searching the villa, Vivien found no trace of Stephen. Not only that, his things were gone. No shared paintings, photos, beloved plants, or collectibles remained. It was like he'd never existed. Had Stephen left? No, impossible. She refuted it. Her Stephen wouldn't leave her. He stayed in H-City over international opportunities, big hospital offers, out of love. Stephen wouldn't just go. Vivien clutched his untouched suit, sitting on the couch all day, time slipping until Richard's return woke her. Vivien, everyone talked, you didn't stay with me. Richard clutched her arm. Let's honeymoon in Bali or Singapore. Enough. Vivien suddenly snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. Her face was no longer soft. It was just cold. Who said anything about a honeymoon? Don't forget we're just fake married. I'm only traveling with Stephen. With that, she shoved Richard aside and got up to leave. Vivien remembered something. Stephen's father was still in the hospital. His dad was sick and couldn't be easily transferred. She didn't believe Stephen wouldn't visit him. She drove to the hospital, speeding the whole way. But when she got to the ward, the room was empty. Where is he? Vivien grabbed a nurse and yelled, "Ma'am, let go of me or I'll call the cops." The nurse shrieked, startled by her. Vivien took a deep breath and pointed at the bed. Where's the person who was here before? Where'd they go? The nurse looked at her suspiciously. Oh, you mean the guy in the coma? He was transferred a long time ago. You didn't know? Your family, right? Transferred? Vivien swayed on her feet, leaning against the wall for support. How could he have been transferred without her knowing? Fear crept over Vivien. If she lost that final connection, she had no idea where to find Stephen. Ignoring the nurse, she staggered away, calling Stephen again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. Vivien found herself near the site of the previous explosion at the hospital, now cordoned off. As she walked by, she overheard some people talking. Poor Stephen, getting caught up in all this. Weren't the pipes clogged? How did they pin it all on Stephen? He was a victim too. Tell me about it. I heard the real culprit was... The nurse gestured upward, and everyone around her fell silent. This time Vivien didn't speak up. She recalled passing by with Richard, seeing Stephen lying on the ground, surrounded by debris from the explosion. Richard had a cut on his forehead. He loved his looks too much to have a scar. She had to get him to a doctor quickly. As for Stephen, others were there, he'd be fine. Besides, the explosion was his fault, right? Maybe he'd learned something. Vivien never thought she did anything wrong. But for a moment, doubt flickered in her mind. She pulled out her phone and texted her assistant. Look into the explosion at the Central Hospital lab. After that, she left the hospital and bumped into Richard outside. He looked dejected, like a pup that had been left behind. Vivien, are you really leaving me? Are you going to let me become a laughingstock? The families were planning to engage them, but Vivien had eyes for Stephen. She insisted on canceling her engagement with Richard to marry Stephen. The Millers, under pressure, forged a fake certificate to appease her. The Millers promised the families a resolution, allowing the two to marry. Despite 2 weddings, the Millers never showed up. Before the third, Vivien discovered her marriage certificate was fake. The Millers declared that she could never legally wed anyone else. Conveniently, Richard stepped up, offering a fake marriage. The plan was a legal marriage where Stephen could be her public husband. Both got what they wanted. He a legal identity. She her affection for Stephen. Vivien agreed, feeling she owed Richard, compensating continuously. Our arrangement is over. I'm not going back with you, she said firmly, heading for her car. Richard darted in front of her car door. At least drive me home. Vivien, you can't leave me to deal with them alone. Around them, people were approaching with banners reading, "Corrupt doctor, give us justice." After a medical mishap was blamed on Stephen, a mob targeted him. Now they had turned to Richard, seemingly triggered by something. Vivien hurried Richard into the car as the crowd pressed in, pounding on the window. Justice! Justice! Come out, murderous doctor! Despite their aggression, they stood their ground, forcing Vivien to decide whether to drive through them. Get out of the way, she shouted, startling Richard. Who leaked this information? Richard stammered, I don't know. I was bored alone on our wedding night, so I went out. I didn't expect all this. Vivien, do you think it's Steven getting back at us? He's upset you're marrying me. The only ones aware of the scapegoat plan were the three of them. With his dad's disappearance, Steven seemed to be retaliating without fear. Vivien hesitated but didn't deny it. She promised Richard she'd get him out of there. A bottle hit the car window, water trailing down as unfamiliar. Burnt plastic scent filled the air. Richard yelled, cowering, "Let's go, Vivien. Drive." Driving through would mean injuries, but security was advancing toward them. A couple of seconds of hesitation, and then Vivien floored the gas. In a flurry of screams, the car shoved through the crowd, injuring several but breaking free. In the rearview mirror, Vivien saw blood pooling under downed figures, while Richard patted his chest in relief. How terrifying. Steven's taken it too far this time. Vivien stayed silent, lighting a cigarette. Richard sniffled. Is Steven hiding? He's not getting away with this. I have an idea, Vivien. Force him out. Let's try it. She glanced at him. He had a plan. Marry me and broadcast it everywhere. Steven just wants you back. He won't stand it. And his dad's grave's still in the city, right? Let's threaten that. He won't ignore it. Once he concluded, Vivien puffed on her cigarette, pondering. The silence lay heavy. But then she agreed, fine, we do it your way. I'll announce our marriage. If Steven doesn't show, we'll desecrate his father's grave. That night, they posed as a married couple, and Vivien posted a photo visible only to Steven. Two hands clasped together, against a backdrop of the master bed. Nothing happened, no likes, no messages. Let's sleep, Vivien. It's our wedding night after all, Richard said, emerging from the bathroom in a robe. Vivien brushed him aside. Don't be ridiculous, Richard. You're like a brother to me. She was holding her phone, constantly refreshing messages. But no matter how much she tried, there was still no message from Steven. Steven seemed to have vanished into thin air. She couldn't get a hold of him. After being pushed away, a flash of jealousy crossed Richard's face. Seeing Vivien about to leave, he wasn't ready to give up. He came up behind her and hugged her, pressing his chest against her back. Vivien, we're already married, right? You've given him your love. Can't you give me a little bit too? His hand moved insistently towards Vivien's chest. At first, Vivien resisted, but she thought every woman does this. She loved Steven, but who among her friends wasn't seeing multiple people? As long as her true love remained Steven, what was the problem? She gave him money, she gave him status, what did he have to complain about? Vivien had a change of heart and hugged Richard back. Richard, Vivien. They both fell onto the bed with red sheets. Things were getting out of control when suddenly Vivien's phone started ringing. She sat up abruptly, and seeing the caller ID, a look of disappointment flashed in her eyes. She hung up the call, intending to continue, but the call came through again. They seemed intent on calling until she answered. With no other option, Vivien picked up the phone. No sooner had she done so than Richard's phone started ringing too. Both phones relayed the same message. Something's happened. Vivien. Something's happened. Richard. From 8 o'clock tonight, the internet was flooded with ambiguous photos of Richard and Vivien, along with stories of her fake double marriage. Vivien, deceitful girl. Vivien, fake marriage. Vivien, Richard, scapegoat. Tags like these dominated trending topics. Meanwhile, Vivien received an anonymous MMS, showing a ripped-up wedding photo and 2 words. Break up. The moment she saw this, one word flashed in Vivien's mind. Done. Steven knew everything. In the following days, the situation spun out of control. No matter how hard Vivien tried to suppress it, she couldn't. The Miller's stock price started to fall, and her family expressed their displeasure, pressuring her to fix things quickly. Even when Vivien released her and Richard's wedding photos, it didn't help. People had already exposed her dealings with Steven, plus someone claiming to work at the civil registry revealed that the Millers falsified marriage documents to deceive people, claiming it was done under pressure. Suddenly, the Millers were at the center of the storm too. It didn't end there. Richard's academic fraud and an incident where he caused a patient death and blamed it on someone else came to light. Angry mobs targeted him, and bereaved families somehow found out where he lived, surrounding his place. Plus, the person Vivien hit with her car at the hospital also came after them, demanding justice. Company stock prices kept plummeting. Vivien was bombarded with phone calls, and dark circles formed under her eyes. After ending another call, she angrily smashed the ashtray. "It's all your fault. If you hadn't caused all this trouble, there wouldn't be online attacks." Vivien's face was furious as she looked at Richard. She lit a cigarette and said, "Richard, we can't cover up the academic stuff anymore. You need to apologize. Apologize, then resign from the hospital. For the affected family, just pay them off and move past it." Richard shrieked at the suggestion, "Why should I apologize? Stephen signed off on it. It's his mistake. I'm not doing it. I still want to be a doctor. If I apologize, I'll never be able to be a doctor again. Vivien, can you bear to see me lose my dream? And if I apologize, what will people think of me? They'll laugh." Richard pouted. There was no way he'd apologize to those common folks. It was just an accident, after all. A little money would resolve it. He knew these people well enough. Vivien, worn out by his persistence, snorted. "Then pay them more. That's more like it. We need to let everyone know it's not my fault. It's Stephen's. He signed the documents. How can they deny it?" Richard fiddled with his hands. "He's been removed anyway. But I can't be. I still want to be a doctor." They exchanged words without a thought for Stephen's dream of being a doctor too. Vivien thought, with the Millers supporting him, there's no need for Stephen to work. Other than them, only Stephen knew about these matters. Vivien's eyes lowered, fingers twiddling. She thought Stephen had gone overboard this time. He got jealous and caused all this trouble. She planned to have a serious talk with him when he returned. But Vivien never got to implement her plan. As she sent her assistant to talk with the families and have the hospital clarify that it was Stephen's doing, someone released the surveillance footage. Though blurry, it showed Richard leaving the operating room while Stephen was seen in the outpatient department helping with consultations. With evidence pinned against Richard as the culprit of the medical incident, along with his credentials and reports being questioned, there was no denying it any longer. Vivien was about to use her power to suppress the mess when she got a call from the police first. "Vivien, you're under investigation for an assault case. Please come with us." Displaying their badge, the police took Vivien away. When they took her, she only had one request: keep her phone on. She was waiting for a call. She couldn't believe Stephen would be so ruthless. He did all this out of jealousy to get back at her. This was Stephen's way. He'd done it. 3 months later, in the US. It was summer when he arrived. Now it's fall. Stephen adjusted his coat, pushing his father through the garden. Samuel was in a wheelchair, though his legs weren't functional. He had much improved from being a vegetable. He was conscious, capable of responding. "Dad, I hear there's a Ginkgo Avenue in November. I'll take you there then." "All right, but don't just talk about me. What about yourself? You're always so busy. Remember to rest." Samuel patted his hand. "That student of Alex's seems nice. Remember to go out when they call you." Stephen smiled and didn't reply. It's been 3 months here. The first month, he was engrossed with his father's care, practically living in the hospital, no time for other thoughts. Once things settled, he began following Alex in various medical research, spinning like a top every day. The news he had about back home came from a hacker he'd hired before. The hacker said they'd used public opinion to crash the stocks, that Richard was fired, and Vivien was detained briefly. But that was it, after all. They were ordinary people, unable to really deal with those families, as even a skinny camel is bigger than a horse, so to speak. Stephen promptly paid the hacker's fee, thereafter never checking anything about back home. By the 3rd month, he earned a spot in Alex's private medical practice as a surgeon. He pushed his father until they reached the entrance, where they ran into his mentor. "Sister, what brings you here?" Stephen greeted. "I was just about to take Dad around town. It's my day off. I thought you were going to play tennis." Jasmine walked forward to take the wheelchair. My plan fell through, so I decided to come see you. Mr. Miller, how are you feeling today? Any sensation in your legs?" Jasmine, as Alex's top student, naturally became Stephen's mentor in the lab. Both being Chinese, they chatted more often, and she looked after him. I can sense warmth and cold water, but no strength to stand yet, Samuel replied. But this is fine, much better than lying down all the time. As they talked and walked a bit, Stephen's phone rang. It was Alex, asking him to come to the practice later. There was a patient looking for him. Are you sure they're looking for me? Stephen asked. Alex. Yeah, Stephen, thanks for sticking it out. I know working overtime on your day off sucks, but don't worry, I'll pay you triple. It's not just about the money. Stephen's okay at medicine, but that's it, just okay. Most people come to see Alex, not him. Who would seek him out alone? After hanging up, he looked at his dad with a bit of regret. Dad, I guess I can't keep walking with you. Let me take you back. Jasmine, I'll keep Uncle company. You go ahead. Maybe it's a patient who heard about you specifically and came to see you. I'll hang out with him for a bit, then come pick you up. She smiled at Samuel. Uncle, it'll just be us for a while. How about we feed some pigeons in the park? Samuel beamed. All right, go on. Jasmine's here with me. He waved Stephen off and excitedly started discussing with Jasmine what to get from last time. Oh, Jasmine, last time you wouldn't believe this cheeky pigeon. It scared off all the others and hogged all the food. If it's there again, I'm shooing it away. Pigeon should know its place. Jasmine gently humored him, and the two slowly walked away. Stephen showed a slight smile as he got in his car to head to the clinic. Even though he's been there just a month, he's already done 3 surgeries, making him somewhat known in the area. He put on his doctor's coat and mask. Entering the office, he nodded slightly. Hello? Please take a seat. Do you have medical records? Or should we do a checkup first? That detached look in his eyes pierced Vivien's heart. After Stephen left, Vivien was detained for a week. During that time, she didn't hear a thing from Stephen. Only then did she realize he had truly left her and knew about the fake marriage certificate. Vivien used to think, well, she gave Stephen her love, a status, and money, things Stephen couldn't get by himself. What more could he want? But when he left, she realized she couldn't do without him. Stephen was the only one who would stay up with her when her stomach hurt, making porridge for her. He remembered all her little preferences, carefully picking out the green onions from her bowl. Even if she wanted to do something childish like play Pop Mart, he was there with her. She spent 2 months sorting out her personal matters before coming to the States to find him. Vivien stared at Stephen with a mix of hope and desperation. Stephen. Stephen tapped the table lightly with his fingers. Miss, please tell me about your symptoms. I'm not feeling well. I heard you're an excellent surgeon here. Surely you won't let personal feelings affect your work? Richard, who'd been ignored since they entered, spoke up. My wrist's injured. I'm a doctor too, and I hope to hold a scalpel again. He extended his hand towards Stephen, his eyes locked onto him. The swollen redness on Richard's wrist wasn't obvious, but his claim of being a doctor amused Stephen. Typing on the computer, he responded, Sir, if you were a doctor, you wouldn't be coming to me. Handing over the medical slip with a blank expression, left turn, then up to the 3rd floor. The nurse will guide you for an X-ray. Come see me after. Richard pulled at Vivien. Vivien, come with me. Vivien remained still. You go by yourself. I have things to do. She frowned, her eyes warning him. Richard winced under her stare and stepped out with the slip alone. In just 3 months, Vivien's attitude toward Richard changed drastically, though Stephen didn't feel much about it. When Stephen realized Vivien deceived him, he knew she might one day do the same to others. Anything else? Feeling wounded, Vivien stared at him. Stephen, do you have to talk to me like this? I messed up, but don't worry, I haven't married Richard. You and I are the real deal. I'm not agreeing to a divorce. Stephen corrected her. Vivien, it's not a divorce. It's a breakup. We never registered. How can we divorce? Her heart stung by his indifference. Stephen ignored her, focusing on the medical file. Wearing frameless glasses, his focused expression during work showed a cool charm that was a stark contrast to his warm actions back then. When they first met, Vivien was a patient and Stephen, with a medical chart under his arm, would visit. His demeanor seemed cold, yet his actions were kind. She couldn't help but be drawn to him. Things changed when they thought they were committed. Stephen was busy, often coming home late and caring deeply about her affairs. Early on, those phone calls from Stephen felt like love, but later, Vivien was annoyed, ignoring calls, claiming work, and not pushing Richard away. Isn't that typical for anyone? She did what any woman might, staying loyal to Stephen. Until he left, Vivien felt sure she was right. She thought apologizing, sending Richard Stephen's way to vent, would fix things. Stephen, Richard tormented you, let people mistreat you. I brought him so you could get your revenge. His hand got hurt, my doing. He kept you from practicing medicine. I'll make sure he loses his surgical ability. Vivien's eyes were sincere. You can take action during the surgery. I'll make sure you're protected. Once willing to harm Stephen for Richard, using his father's life as leverage, now she could casually suggest breaking Richard. Stephen looked at her for a moment. Vivien, it seems I never truly knew you. Politely, he asked her to leave his office and assured her he wouldn't do such a thing. Upon returning inside, Stephen saw Richard in the hallway, bearing the exam sheet. He looked over with a venomous glare, as if Vivien's words had reached him. Stephen, with no interest in their drama, shut his door. Soon enough, shouts and a slap were heard outside. 3 months ago, Vivien would fight the world for Richard. Now, she slapped him and had his hand ruined. On the final note entered into the computer, Stephen's gaze softened only at a message from Jasmine. Jasmine sent a picture, a serene scene of Samuel in a wheelchair, pigeons resting on him, with one perched in his hand. It exuded warmth and peace. Stephen couldn't help but long to join them. He packed quickly, awaiting Richard's exam results. After half an hour, only Vivien returned. Stephen, I've made dinner reservations at a Chinese place. Come eat. Their dishes are all your favorites. Intently, she watched him. Once back home, we can finalize things. You, me, your dad will be family. Stephen reminded her. Miss, I'm waiting for a patient. We're not familiar. Plus, I have plans tonight. Our policy restricts private interactions between doctors and patients. Vivien, Richard's already gone. He didn't want you to have the surgery, so he left. But don't worry, I'll bring him back. However he treated you, I'll treat him the same. She started talking to herself, not giving Stephen a chance to say anything. Stephen couldn't be bothered with her. Since Richard left, there was no reason to wait. He took off his white coat and left on his own. He got in his car and drove away right in front of Vivien, not giving her a chance to approach. His tone was so indifferent, it was like they were strangers, and Vivien was just some creep trying to cling to him. When they were together before, no matter what Vivien did, Stephen would wait for her. If she was fast, he'd be fast. If she was slow, he'd be slow. He said their shoulders had to be in line with each other for a long-lasting relationship. This was the first time Stephen just walked away from her. After he left, Vivien followed him by car. Stephen went to the park. After parking, he saw a cotton candy vendor and bought 2 on a whim. Even though Jasmine was in her 30s, she still loved such kid-like treats. Stephen approached her with a rabbit-shaped cotton candy, saying, "Here's your reward." A reward, as Jasmine was sweet every day. He gave another one to Samuel. "Dad, after this, no more candy tonight. You need moderation." Samuel chuckled. All right, I got it. What about me? Can I have a bit more?" Jasmine tore off the rabbit's ear, but instead of eating it, she offered it to Stephen. "Stephen, you go first." He took a bite from her hand. The foreign cotton candy had the same shape as back home but lacked a bit in taste. Still, it stirred some memories for him. "Jasmine, same rule for you, everyone gets a set amount of candy." He gave her arm a playful nudge and then asked a few questions about his father's health. The two of them pushed Samuel along the lawn. Pigeons, now fed, occasionally flew over them. It was a harmonious and beautiful scene. Vivien, unfamiliar with the area, had trouble parking and arrived 10 minutes later. As she came up, she saw the scene from afar and found it jarring. Vivien clenched her fist and strode over. "Dad, how are you feeling?" She was all smiles as she crouched in front of Samuel. "It's me, Vivien. It's my fault. I should have been with you here for treatment. After all, I am your daughter-in-law." Samuel didn't respond how she expected. Instead, with a cold tone, he said, "Oh, Vivien, you're joking. Daughter-in-law? You and my son haven't even registered your marriage. Are you staying around to pull my oxygen cord?" Though he was in a vegetative state, he had some awareness. He heard Vivien's threat about the oxygen in the hospital but couldn't speak up then. Hearing him call her out made Vivien's expression change. She maintained her fake smile. "Dad, what are you talking about? Stephen and I are married. You even said you wanted a grandchild from us. I admit the hospital thing, I messed up, but that was an accident. I've already punished Richard. It won't happen again. Please, give me another chance." With that, she stood and instinctively tried to take Jasmine's place at the wheelchair. But Jasmine, though slim, was actually quite strong from regular exercise. She firmly held the wheelchair's handles. "Vivien, let me handle it. It's not for you to worry about Stephen and Uncle. Who are you? This is between Stephen and me." Vivien snapped, "I suggest you butt out." Samuel interjected, "Vivien, please call me Uncle. And Jasmine, she's one of us. You're the outsider here. You're the one who should butt out. Stephen, let's go." Without giving Vivien another look, Samuel moved to leave with Stephen. Vivien turned to Stephen with a pitiful look, but he ignored her plight. "Dad, Jasmine, I know a spot with some street performers ahead. Let's check it out," Stephen suggested. "After the show, we can grab some dinner." Jasmine was cool with that. "Sure, we can pick up ingredients and I can cook for you at home." Stephen replied, "Great, I'm looking forward to it." The two chatted and laughed, Stephen's eyes twinkling with joy. Meanwhile, Vivien stood alone, ignored. Watching Stephen, she remembered when he used to look at her that way. Back then, it didn't matter what he was doing. Seeing her always brought a smile to his face. People say you only smile genuinely when you see the one you love. Has Stephen fallen for this woman then? Just the thought of it made Vivien feel suffocated. She tailed them like a stalker, watching them attend a musical performance together, then share a meal at the same table, and even return home. It wasn't until Jasmine left that Vivien finally breathed a sigh of relief. For the whole week, Vivien showed up at the house every day, trailing Stephen to work like a shadow. But since they ran a hospital, there were people coming and going. And with her not causing any real trouble, there was no clear reason to kick her out. Stephen had thought Richard would go off on Vivien after learning about her stance. But instead, Richard went on like nothing happened, continuing to seek treatment from Stephen and even trying to win back Vivien. "Vivien, even if he ignores you, I won't. Let's go back. I'll cook for you," he said. "Get away." Vivien saw Stephen coming over and quickly pushed Richard away. "Stephen, I brought you breakfast." Stephen didn't even glance her way. He was discussing a patient's condition and the upcoming surgery plan with Jasmine. Vivien was getting on his nerves. Before Stephen even reached the elevator, she was already hovering. "Stephen, you haven't had breakfast, have you? I brought your favorite dim sum, made by a chef I specially hired from back home." She was like glue, trying to follow Stephen into the elevator, but Jasmine stopped her. "Vivien, unauthorized personnel can't come in. Also, let me remind you, you have no relationship with Stephen. Your behavior is troubling him. If you continue, Stephen can call the police." Jasmine blocked the elevator, pressing the close button, and only releasing it after the elevator began to ascend. Vivien's pleasant face was reserved for Stephen. Once he left, she immediately changed her expression. "Who do you think you are? You have no say in matters between Stephen and me." Jasmine's eyes were cold, almost like she was a different person. "Vivien, life hasn't been easy for you back home, has it? Some things you can cover up, some you can't. I'm afraid the Millers can barely take care of themselves, let alone you chasing after Stephen. If the Millers fall, I wonder if you'll still be in the mood for this nonsense." "Oh wait, the Millers have already taken a hit. Because of your antics, their stock prices keep dropping. How much longer can you keep this up?" After saying this, Vivien's eyes flickered. The Millers were indeed not in a good place. The explosive news 3 months ago, especially involving medical issues, was impossible to suppress. With Richard being pushed into the spotlight, he didn't dare let go of Vivien, hoping to rise through the Millers. But the Millers were struggling too, and with Vivien's mind on Stephen, The company's affairs were a mess. None of your business. Once Stephen returns home with me, everything will be fine. Vivien snorted, pressing the up button to go upstairs. Jasmine didn't waste words and followed her upstairs. As they both entered the elevator, Richard, with a dark look, stepped out from behind a pillar. Once again, it was Stephen. He thought going abroad would have made her settle down. But who would have thought he'd still have Vivien obsessed? A vicious glint flashed in Richard's eyes. After a moment, he took the stairs up. This morning, Stephen had a surgery scheduled, with 2 reports in the afternoon. The surgery was set to start at 9 a.m. sharp. After changing, he did his rounds. Just as he left the patient's room, a bucket of cold water was dumped on him. Stephen, go to hell. It's your fault for tempting Vivien. Richard tossed the bucket aside and pulled out a watermelon knife, aiming for Stephen's chest. He attacked fiercely. Stephen dodged quickly, but still ended up with a slash on his shoulder. You're crazy, Stephen shouted, but Richard was completely unhinged. Richard brandished the knife, eyes bloodshot as he charged again. I'm crazy, all right? If I can't have you, no one can. A sane person had no way to handle a lunatic. Stephen, fearing to injure his hands, didn't dare resist with his right hand, only dodging repeatedly. Richard seemed to exploit his vulnerability, aiming the knife once more at Stephen's hand. At that critical moment, Jasmine rushed in, shielding Stephen. The knife stabbed into her shoulder. She grunted, kicking Richard away, pain barely held at bay. Vivien, a step too late, rushed to Stephen, full of concern. Stephen, are you badly hurt? Let me help bandage you. Stephen pushed her away, colder than ever. Vivien, control your people. I'll report this to the police. He then went to check Jasmine's wounds, a regular fruit knife, intimidating but not deeply piercing. Stephen helped her up, senior sis. Let's get your wound treated. I've already called the police. Jasmine nodded. Neither spared another glance at Richard or Vivien. While Vivien wanted to speak more, hospital staff stopped her. Miss, please come with us. Ha ha ha, Vivien, he doesn't want you. He doesn't. Richard laughed, disheveled with a footprint on his chest, looking nothing like a rich heir. You're stuck with me. I'm the right match for you. You said you'd marry me. How can you change your heart? He babbled on even when the police showed up. Meanwhile, Stephen and Jasmine never made another appearance, letting lawyers handle everything. Even Vivien's desperate plea to see Stephen received a cold reply. Vivien, my client does not wish to see you. Please respect that. For the first time, Vivien realized she might lose Stephen. Her Stephen no longer loved her. With that thought, her gaze fixed on Richard in the holding cell, colder than ever. Stephen was kidnapped while delivering gauze and iodine for Jasmine. Walking down the street, a car pulled up beside him. Someone covered his mouth and nose from behind, knocking him out. He awoke in an abandoned warehouse, blinking tears from the overhead light glaring in his eyes. Vivien, what are you doing? Stephen was tied to a chair, facing Vivien. Richard lay on the floor, disheveled, surrounded by surgical knives. Vivien was sterilizing a knife under the stark light, looking ghostly. At the sound of his voice, she turned with a smile. Stephen, he hurt you. I'll make him pay. Stephen, seeing her smile, felt a jolt of fear. He kicked the ground, trying to back away, his fear evident. Vivien, momentarily hurt, pleaded, Stephen, I'm doing this for you. How can you be scared of me? Still, she composed herself. Once I get revenge for you, we'll go back home and everything will be normal. You'll forgive me, right? She was clearly unstable. Stephen, fearing to provoke her, stayed silent. Just then, Richard on the floor awoke, first delighted, then screaming, Vivien, what are you doing? Let me go. Vivien's eyes darkened. Because of you, Stephen hates me. Once I punish you, he'll forgive me. Crouching with a surgical knife, she warned, Richard, everyone pays for their actions. Richard froze, then laughed maniacally. Consequence? Vivien, shouldn't you be paying the price? You're the mastermind. You're the real culprit. What are you waiting for? Stab yourself if you're so gutsy. He taunted, laughing even as he urged, do it. What's stopping you? Ah! Richard screamed, but Vivien seemed deaf to it. She plunged the knife in and out, blood splattering on her face. You're right, it is my fault, she muttered. I am the one to blame. Turning, she walked toward Stephen, clutching the knife, eyes wild with madness. Panic-stricken, Stephen calculated his next move. Vivien's mental state was clearly off. Before he could talk, Vivien acted first. She raised the knife and, amidst Stephen's terrified gaze, plunged it into her chest. Stephen, you hate me. I'll kill myself to make it up to you. Will you forgive me now? Vivien collapsed at his feet, her blood soaking his legs and arms, a tragic spectacle. But Stephen's eyes showed no hint of sympathy, only fear. Vivien, was it worth it? Half conscious, Vivien heard Stephen's cold voice. Wrong is wrong. No matter what you do, we can't go back to the way things were. I'll never forgive you. The sound of sirens grew louder as the police burst in. Vivien and Richard had both fainted from blood loss. Jasmine rushed to Stephen's side. Stephen, are you okay? She asked. Stephen shook his head. I'm fine. Jasmine quickly untied the ropes around him, her concern evident at the sight of red marks on his wrists. Stephen could feel her trembling as she held him close. I'm really okay, he reassured her. She didn't mean to hurt me. She just wanted to teach Richard a lesson. Even though Vivien looked terrifying, Stephen knew the knife wasn't meant for him. But Vivien's sudden madness had shaken them both. Luckily, Jasmine had called the police the moment she couldn't reach Stephen. The police took Richard and Vivien to the hospital. Stephen went along to give a statement. This was happening abroad, where emotional disputes aren't easy to deal with. News came from the hospital that Richard's hand was severely injured, and he'd never be able to use his right hand again. Although Vivien's self-inflicted stab wound wasn't fatal, she hit her head when she fell and might become a vegetative state. Vivien had once threatened Stephen with his own father, who was in a vegetative state, to take the fall for Richard. Now one of them was crippled, and the other might become a vegetative state. When Stephen heard this, he thought of a saying, what goes around comes around. Whatever, he said, has got nothing to do with us. Let's go back home next year. By then, my dad's condition will have improved. He smiled gently at Jasmine. We're from China anyway, going back makes sense. I have some friends there. I'll introduce you when we go. Jasmine agreed, saying, okay, we'll move back to China. We can buy you a house you like. If you'd rather not work in a hospital, you could open a private clinic or a health facility, whatever you like, he suggested. She painted her picture of their future, sparkling-eyed. Stephen leaned next to her, listening quietly, until Jasmine carefully asked Stephen, I said we. Do you understand what I mean? They hadn't known each other long, but a lot had happened. After the incident with Vivien, Stephen thought about being alone, but Jasmine was different. She cautiously tested boundaries and gently accepted him. Even knowing his past, she'd patiently talk him through his issues. She'd even rush to help him blindly when he was in danger. Stephen noticed the vulnerability in her eyes. He mischievously asked, what if I don't understand you? Jasmine, I'm just scared, he admitted. Marriage feels like a gamble, especially after everything with Vivien. Before he finished speaking, Jasmine put a pile of bank cards and ID cards in his hand and opened her banking app right in front of him. I have some stocks that aren't liquid yet, but I have over 10 million in cash and I'm transferring it to you. You'll own everything and have the power to leave me whenever you want. I have properties in the States and China and I'll transfer those to you when we go back, she said. Stephen, our money will be yours. Being with me means you can always walk away, and I'll be the one left behind. I'm not saying this because I think you care about money, but because I want to give it all to you. Just give me a chance. Her voice was earnest yet a little self-deprecating. Stephen quickly grabbed her phone to stop her. Okay, who needs your money? I've got a salary, remember? Jasmine let out a quiet "oh" and hung her head like a little puppy. Stephen couldn't help but soften. He patted her head. Didn't we say we'd go back next year? For now, let's focus on our work. We should help our teacher recruit new staff. Saying that, he noticed Jasmine hadn't moved, so he held her hand. At the slightest touch, Jasmine's eyes widened in disbelief. Stephen just smiled softly at her. "Stephen," she said. Stephen shook their intertwined hands slightly. "Coming? Coming." Jasmine replied with determination, "You're the one who held my hand first. You can't let go now." Stephen teased, "Maybe you'll be the one to let go first." Jasmine held on tighter. No way. They were as childish as two kids from kindergarten, walking hand in hand toward the hospital. The sun stretched their shadows long behind them. A year later, Stephen and Jasmine boarded a plane back home with Samuel. Just after landing, Stephen noticed the news on an airport TV. S Group was going through bankruptcy restructuring, and the original heir Vivien was still in a coma. He glanced at it briefly before looking over at Jasmine. They exchanged a glance and then both smiled. They pushed their luggage slowly toward the exit. The road ahead was long, but having someone by your side on this journey of life doesn't sound too bad.